Chapter 1: The Crossroads. It was one of those mornings when everything felt slightly off. The kind of day where the air felt heavier than usual, not with humidity, but with an unnameable tension. Sitting at my kitchen table, I stared blankly at my steaming cup of coffee. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, carving sharp patterns on the granite countertop, but even the bright morning light couldn't lift the haze in my mind. Below, the city stretched out in its usual vastness, a sea of steel, concrete, and restless movement. Maxwell Heights, the financial district of New Haven City, stood at the center of it all, towering as a monument to ambition and relentless drive. For years, I had been part of its machinery. My days were built on precision, each hour meticulously accounted for. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., coffee by 6:45, and out the door by 7:30. The world moved according to my schedule, and I liked it that way. Control was my currency, both in my personal life and in business. But today, something was out of sync. Perhaps it was the dream I'd woken from, fragmented images of winding roads and crossroads, fading into nothingness as soon as I opened my eyes. Or maybe it was the coffee itself, which tasted bitter despite being brewed the same way it always had been. I glanced at the clock. 7:10, time to move. But even as I slipped into my usual routine, brushing my teeth, adjusting my tie, grabbing my briefcase, there was a weight in the back of my mind that I couldn't ignore. It followed me out the door, down the elevator, and into the garage, where my sleek black sedan waited in its usual spot. By the time I eased onto the expressway, the feeling had settled in like a stone in my chest. The day began to unravel around noon. I was scheduled to attend a networking lunch at Redfield Golf Club, an upscale retreat located just outside the city limits. It was one of those obligatory events I dreaded, an afternoon of forced smiles, strategic handshakes, and polite but shallow conversation. But appearances mattered, and so I went. Route 47 stretched out before me, a winding road that cut through the dense pine forests surrounding the outskirts of New Haven. I had driven this route countless times before, yet it always felt foreign to me. The towering trees on either side of the road were a stark contrast to the polished chaos of the city, their looming presence both unnerving and oddly calming. The air out here was different too, crisp and clean, tinged with the earthy scent of pine needles. And yet I hated it. The emptiness of it all, the silence broken only by the hum of my car's engine. It felt like stepping into a world that had been abandoned halfway through its creation. That was when it happened. A sudden thump jolted me from my thoughts, followed by the rhythmic thwop-thwop-thwop of a flat tire. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I guided the car to the side of the road, gravel crunching beneath the tires. I muttered a curse under my breath, pulling the car to a stop and shutting off the engine. The air around me was heavy with the midday heat, the sun glaring down from a cloudless sky. Climbing out of the car, I walked around to the rear tire, already knowing what I would find. Sure enough, it was a mess. The rubber was shredded, jagged edges curling outward like the teeth of a wild animal. I crouched down, staring at it as if willing it to fix itself. But of course it didn't. And that's when I realized I had no idea how to change a tire. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. For all my success and carefully crafted control, I was utterly useless in this moment. My phone, naturally, had no signal out here. The thought of waiting hours for roadside assistance made my stomach turn. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hands hovering uselessly at my sides. Then I saw him. He appeared from the bend in the road, walking at a leisurely pace with a battered backpack slung over one shoulder. He was young, 16, maybe 17, his shaggy brown hair falling into his eyes as he moved. His sneakers were scuffed, and his oversized t-shirt hung loose on his lanky frame. He walked with an air of confidence that seemed almost at odds with his surroundings, as if he owned the road beneath his feet. He noticed me almost immediately, his gaze flicking from me to the car and back again. There was no hesitation in his step as he approached, stopping a few feet away and shoving his hands into his pockets. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice casual but tinged with amusement. I blinked, caught off guard by his question. Yeah. Flat tire." The boy tilted his head, studying the car with a faint smirk. "Got a spare?" "In the trunk," I said, motioning toward the back of the car. "But I've never done this before." To my surprise, he grinned, dropping his backpack onto the gravel. "Good thing I have. Pop the trunk." For a moment, I hesitated. Was it safe to let a stranger mess with my car? But what choice did I have? He didn't look threatening, just a kid with a confident air and hands that seemed accustomed to hard work. I reached into my pocket and pressed the button on my key fob, the trunk popping open with a faint click. The boy, who introduced himself as Owen, worked with a practiced efficiency that was almost mesmerizing to watch. He loosened the lug nuts with steady hands, his thin arms flexing as he cranked the wrench. He slid the jack into place, lifting the car with ease before carefully removing the damaged tire. "You ever think about learning how to do this yourself?" he asked, glancing up at me with a faint smirk. I shrugged, feeling slightly embarrassed. "I always figured I'd just call someone." "Well, now you're learning," Owen said, his tone light but not unkind. "Consider it a life skill." As he worked, I couldn't help but notice the ease with which he moved, his hands sure and deliberate in their actions. There was something reassuring about his presence, a quiet confidence that seemed unshakable, even in the face of a stranger's problem. Within 15 minutes, he had the spare tire in place, tightening the bolts with a final twist of the wrench. "There," he said, standing up and brushing the dust off his jeans. "Good as new." I reached for my wallet. "Let me pay you for..." But Owen raised a hand, cutting me off with a shake of his head. "Nah, don't worry about it. Just helping out." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. He didn't say it with pity or condescension, just matter-of-factly, like helping a stranger was the most natural thing in the world. Before I could argue, he slung his backpack over his shoulder and started walking away. "Hey," I called after him. He turned, raising an eyebrow. "Thanks." He smiled, a quick, genuine grin that lingered in my mind long after he disappeared around the bend. Chapter 2, Owen. I drove away from the side of the road, the hum of the spare tire steady beneath the car, yet my thoughts were anything but. Owen. The name clung to my mind as if etched there. He was so unlike anyone I'd encountered in years. In my world, acts of generosity were rare, always tied to ulterior motives, business deals, or strategic networking. But Owen hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't even lingered long enough for me to insist on paying him. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I replayed the brief interaction over and over. The ease with which he had stepped in, the confidence in his movements, the casual way he brushed off my thanks, everything about him felt foreign and strangely refreshing. How often did people like that even exist? Especially out here, on this quiet, forgotten stretch of road that seemed miles away from the bustling chaos of New Haven City. The rest of the drive to the Redfield Golf Club passed in a blur. When I finally arrived, I barely registered the sprawling green fields, the pristine white clubhouse, or the neatly dressed men and women gathering in small groups. Normally, I would have thrown myself into the event, moving from one conversation to the next with practiced ease. Networking was an art, one I had perfected over the years. But today, my heart wasn't in it. I went through the motions, shaking hands, exchanging business cards, nodding at anecdotes I barely heard, but my mind kept drifting back to Owen. Who was he? Why had he helped me so willingly? And what kind of life did he return to after walking away from me on that dusty road? By the time I returned home that evening, exhaustion had settled over me like a heavy blanket. Yet even as I tried to push the thoughts aside, they refused to fade. Sitting in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the sleek, minimalist decor I'd chosen to project success, I felt a strange emptiness. For the first time in years, I couldn't help but question whether the life I had built for myself was as fulfilling as I'd always convinced myself it was. The weekend, a lingering thought. The weekend came and went, but the encounter with Owen lingered in my mind. I spent Saturday catching up on work, answering emails, and reviewing proposals, yet every task felt oddly hollow. My thoughts kept wandering back to Route 47, to the boy with the easy grin and dirt-streaked hands. By Sunday, I couldn't ignore the pull any longer. I found myself scrolling through my phone, searching for excuses to justify a return to that stretch of road. Maybe I'd forgotten something when I broke down, dropped a tool, or misplaced a belonging. Or maybe it was simply curiosity that drove me, a need to understand why Owen's simple act of kindness had unsettled me so deeply. It was late afternoon when I finally gave in. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city streets as I climbed into my car and started the engine. This time, the drive felt different. The usual monotony of the expressway gave way to an almost palpable anticipation as I approached the familiar turnoff to Route 47. The road was as quiet as I remembered, its winding curves flanked by towering pines and overgrown fields. I slowed as I approached the spot where I'd broken down, half expecting to see Owen waiting there. But of course, the roadside was empty. I pulled over anyway, stepping out of the car and scanning the horizon. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Just as I was about to give up and leave, I saw him. Owen emerged from the bend in the road, his backpack slung low over one shoulder. He looked up as he approached, his expression flickering with a mix of surprise and amusement. "You again," he said, smirking as he stopped a few feet away. "Another flat?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "I just wanted to thank you. Properly this time." Owen raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You already tried that," he said, folding his arms across his chest. "Remember?" "Yeah, but I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know. I guess I wanted to return the favor." He chuckled, shifting the weight of his backpack. "Unless you know how to fix a leaky roof, I'm not sure what you can do." "Try me," I said, the words surprising even me. "The house." Owen didn't reply right away, but after a moment, he shrugged and gestured for me to follow. "All right," he said. "Your funeral." I followed him down a narrow dirt path that veered off the main road. The trees grew thicker here, their branches forming a canopy overhead that dappled the ground with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Owen walked ahead of me, his step sure and unhurried, while I struggled to keep up in my polished city shoes. After 10 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing, and there it was, Owen's house. The building was modest, to say the least. Its once white paint had faded to a dull gray, peeling in long strips that fluttered slightly in the breeze. The porch sagged under the weight of neglect, its wooden planks warped and cracked. One of the windows had been patched with a sheet of plastic, and the roofline dipped unevenly, as if the structure itself was bowing under some invisible pressure. "Welcome to the palace," Owen said, his tone laced with dry humor, as he climbed the creaking steps to the front door. Inside, the air was warm and faintly stale, carrying the faint smell of damp wood and old dust. The living room was sparsely furnished, a threadbare couch, a wobbly coffee table, and a small TV that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. A pair of sneakers sat by the door, and a stack of dishes dried on the counter. "Owen?" a voice called from another room. A younger boy appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was smaller than Owen, his sandy brown hair falling in messy curls around his face. His eyes, bright and curious, widened slightly when he saw me. "Who's this?" he asked, glancing at Owen. "This is Ben," Owen said, tossing his backpack onto the couch. "The guy with the flat tire." The boy grinned, his expression mischievous. "Oh, the helpless city guy?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Yeah, that's me." "This is Drew," Owen said, nodding toward the boy. "My little brother." Drew stepped forward, extending a hand with a confidence that felt older than his years. "Nice to meet you, Mr. City Guy." "Nice to meet you too, Drew," I replied, shaking his hand. The crack in the ceiling. The living room ceiling was the first thing I noticed. A jagged crack ran across its surface, the plaster around it discolored and warped. It wasn't just cosmetic damage. The wood underneath was clearly swollen from years of exposure to water. "How long has it been like this?" I asked, tilting my head to get a better look. "Couple of years," Owen replied, leaning against the wall. "It gets worse when it rains. We just don't sit under it." I frowned, glancing around the rest of the room. The damage wasn't limited to the ceiling. There were cracks in the walls, and one of the windows had been taped shut to keep out drafts. It was clear that Owen and Drew were doing their best to hold the house together, but the weight of years was beginning to show. "You ever think about getting it fixed?" I asked. "With what money?" Owen shot back, his tone blunt but not unkind.